Hello, Zach. I want to talk today. It's a little bit nerdy. It's a little bit wonky. America is a genetics nation. America is steeped in what I would call reductionism. What's your understanding? When I say reductionism, what's your understanding of what that means?
Well, reductionism in all forms, but you're talking about addiction or everything?
Everything.
Well, we reduce complex or complicated concepts into some magical solution or reason why these complex problems or issues or things happen. And it yields the very definition of reductionism, why it would be pejorative, is that it yields no results that actually solve or help the matters at hand.
And the reductionism has a special reference to biology. Mm-hmm. It implies reducing addiction and mental health and illness to biological kernels. And one way of thinking about it is the more you reduce it down, the less connection you have to the world around you. And so reductionism in a way, and one particular form of biological reductionism is geneticism, the belief that, well, it's our genes that determine everything. And that's really been imbued throughout American history. We're a genetics kind of a nation. There used to be something in America where they would map out the brain and they would have pictures of each part of the brain. And this was like intelligence, and this was like love, and this is like sociability. It was a topology of the mind. And in many ways, we've never really escaped from that.
Before you launch in, I had an example yesterday, because this bleeds into everything, not about genetics necessarily, but about the brain. And we were talking it was a district-wide staff meeting about mindfulness. And I was tasked to do these little questionnaires, and it said, rate yourself on how well you understand the neuroscience behind mindfulness. So like the reason why mindfulness is effective is the neuroscience. And of course, my answer was something like, I think I have a good idea of what you're trying to get me to understand, but I don't know why I would need to understand it, to understand that mindfulness is an effective strategy. And people couldn't even, there wasn't even a conversation.
It's so imbued in us. In a way, mindfulness is a way of worsening brain chemistry.
Exactly.
It's okay, you got a brain, but you are able, through techniques of the mind, to reorient your thinking and your reactions and your emotions and your awareness. It exceeds it's almost like it's anti-reductionism.
The brain scan is nothing without the brain scan is zero without the first person account. It would not mean anything. And so I think
and the critical issue, which I'm going to get back to by the end of this little blurb, is being in control of how your mind works and believing you're in control is critical to mental health. So It's a paradox. The more you believe in reductionism, naive reductionism, the more likely you are to suffer from the things that reductionism is supposed to explain and cure. So let's go back to the beginning of the last century. There's always been a eugenics movement in the United States. Do you know what eugenics are?
Yeah, creating people based on genes, and creating the kind of person that you want based on genes.
And when we had a big immigration influx at the turn of the last century, around 1900, the sense was we were bringing in inferior races. Mm-hmm. And inferior races in those days meant Italian, Irish, and Jews. And superior races were Nordic and English. And so, and at the same time, there was a movement, of course, to eugenicize African Americans and people who are mentally retarded, they thought,
right,
as a way of preventing them from reproducing. We were like a giant breeding pit. Mm-hmm. And that was very, very powerful. And there arose a movement at the beginning of the century, which was a whole different perspective, which we would call cultural anthropology. And the major thinkers in that thing were a man named Franz Boas, who was German, And he introduced the idea of cultural relativism. But eugenics sort of implies, well, we've got a thing and everybody else should be our thing. It's like American exceptionalism. Everybody else in the world is or should be trying to live like us.
And we live in that slice of the world where we believe that that way of thinking is superior. That's just what human beings are.
Exactly right. And that's true. Human beings are like that. Every tribe sort of thinks, well, we're the home tribe. What the hell's the matter with those other people? But America achieved so much power that it was able to impose its cultural egotism on the rest of, and it still does in a large extent. And it's having disaster. I'll get to the end. It has disastrous effects for addiction and mental health. We're bringing up the rear and leading at the front in that. And then there were two women. Boaz ended up being a professor at Columbia. He was born in Germany. Then there was Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. They were both American mainliners. They both came from the hands of America. And they introduced the whole idea, which it's hard to believe that somebody had introduced the idea, but if they came back tomorrow, they would reintroduce the same ideas. Different cultures inculcate different values through child rearing practices. And children learn how to view the world from learning from their parents. What's that? That's actually embedded in a branch of psychology. Albert Bandura's social learning theory. So it had to be rediscovered. And it was sort of like they're very, Benedict and Margaret Mead, for want of a better word, were WASPs. Boaz was a German. But these cultural relativism and cultural anthropology ideas were viewed as like kind of socialist and communist. And, what are they saying? That like Europeans and German people are as good as us? And if you jump to the future, you mean drinking wine every day is like a way you can live? And those customs they have in Africa and all, those aren't aberrations from Christianity. It was a whole reversal of our mindset.
How did you make that jump? How did you make the jump? I actually know how you made the jump, but explain how you made the jump from cultural relativism to thinking of drinking as actually a way that you can live. Well,
one of the biggest variables between cultures is how people view psychoactive substances and alcohol. And of course, it varies over history and it varies from culture to culture. I mean, sometimes I get a little arrogant when I give a lecture. Last time I gave a national addiction lecture in Northern Ireland. And I said, so people drink differently from Ireland and Italy. Ireland has changed quite a bit, but Irish drinkers were famous as extreme weekend drinkers, and Italian drinkers are people who drink wine daily. Right. And I said, and I picked a woman out. I do this, damn my eyes. And I said, have you been to Italy? And she said, yes. And I said, do you notice how they approach alcohol differently? And she says, well, I'm not sure what you're talking about. I said, you went to Italy and you didn't notice how people drank wine? It's impossible to ignore because they give you wine when you sit down at a meal. So anyhow, I'm back to Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead did the most alarming thing. She wrote, growing up in Samoa, and in the South Pacific, there's tremendous less conflict. Sex, as people mature into sex, they just have sex. And then there was a backlash against Margaret Mead. And of course, that violated 1950s American culture. And so there was a backlash against Margaret Mead. And there were books written, well, she made all that up. She liked to have sex, so she present. And then there was a backlash against the backlash. And one of the leaders of that is a friend of mine named Herein, who wrote Sex at Dawn. Because the concept is that sexual morality and differences in male and gender sexuality. In Margaret Mead, Samoa, girls and women were just as likely to want and initiate sex as men.
And he gets the same charge, by the way. The evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein was on Joe Rogan saying, Joe brought up, "Hey, this is my friend Chris Ryan," and Brett Weinstein talked about his book, and Brett Weinstein said, "Yeah, it's okay book, but it's been more a book like if you want to have sex a lot with a lot of different partners, then it's like your Bible, but I don't know about if it's reality."
So Chris Ryan's basic analysis was, if you look at the world's cultures, both, if you travel around the world and if you look in history, sex was not, monogamous sex was not a way of organizing life. That was a result of capitalism. And capitalism, America was the quintessential capitalist society. So we developed a morality within the last 150 years of monogamy and possessiveness and male dominance, which wasn't true for, human beings have been around for 50,000 years. If you go back to hunter-gatherer societies, women were exactly equal. And Chris Ryan goes into looking at chimpanzees, where females are often dominant sexually. Mm-hmm. And so we've had imposed on us by sociobiology. So let's get into sociobiology. Mm-hmm. In 1970s, I haven't got done with World War II yet. Something ruined eugenics, and that was Hitler.
Yeah, I was going to say this.
Hitler organized a society around eugenics and genetic difference. That just came up recently with Whoopi Goldberg saying, well, it wasn't racial.
About race.
For the Nazis, everything was racial and controlling, and they castrated homosexuals and they eugenicized entire populations. So they gave eugenics a bad name. It took Hitler and Nazism to inspire America to say, maybe Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict had a point. It isn't just like that some people have inferior views. They sort of just do things maybe differently, and maybe they're not inferior.
Right.
And so for the strange reason of Hitler, cultural anthropology became a dominant force in America, centered in Columbia University. Margaret Mead got her PhD under Ruth Benedict, and she got hers under Franz Boas at Columbia. And then along came sociobiology. You know what name was most associated with sociobiology? It was a big name. It was Edward O. Wilson, and he was at Harvard. And sociobiology was a specific version of genetics. It's the idea that, for example, monogamy is bred into human beings because women have to have a baby and they need to be protected. Therefore, they're biologically programmed to be monogamous, and males are biologically programmed to spread their seed. And so, but they expanded that. Sociobiology has a natural tendency to expand itself to say, well, the whole way we organize our culture is biological. It's bred into our genes through evolution. And of course, it immediately gets into economic differences and racial differences. It just naturally makes that leap. And there were two Jewish guys at Harvard who fought that, and their names were Richard Lewontin. I knew Richard Lewontin. He only died last year. He won a Nobel Prize. He was able to breed, fruit flies breed in hours. So you could do evolutionary research over generations with fruit flies. And he showed that fruit flies could shift on a button, that even within the simplest DNA structures, they had such a wide variety of possibilities that you could, a population could change almost instantaneously. And Stephen Jay Gould talked about the mismeasurement of man, and he was focusing on IQ tests, at the time that they came to be big, we were, it was after the 60s, and there was a desire and a need to escape from sexism and racism. And so Lewontin and Gould were big. I would visit Lewontin in his laboratories at Harvard. I was beginning to write things like the reductionism of psychology of the 80s was I writing. I wrote that like in 1979. So they were popular for a time, but then starting in the 70s, they were called evolutionary biologists. They studied kind of the kinks, non-Darwinian evolution. In other words, it wasn't just survival of the fittest and only the smart achieved the best. That's a strange way of looking at it. Both of them came from New York Jewish socialist backgrounds, Lewontin and Gould. And they were saying, well, how you organize society. So you see that in a way, Chris Ryan was repeating an old dispute. And then along came evolutionary psychology, along with the neuroscience revolution in the 1970s. And it said, you know what? We've sold genetics short. They didn't go back and say Hitler was right, of course. They said, you know, we're not emphasizing genetics enough. And there's always been a hotbed, a core belief in America. Well, everything's sort of genetic. And then came the Human Genome Project. I'm giving you a lot of unfair questions. These are things I've thought about for decades. What was the bottom line of the Human Genome Project? What did they think they were going to discover? What did they discover?
They thought that they were going to discover a myriad of genes that you could look at a gene and connect that directly to a trait that a human being had.
And particular mental illness, schizophrenia and depression. Right. And what did they find that stunned them?
That the number of genes by which everything is made, we are made, was not so much more than, what was it, a worm?
Earthworm.
You know, I mean, we're just...
Human beings have about 40,000 distinct genes, and earthworms have about 30,000. So what the hell else is on the chromosome? What is all that other DNA about? And the answer is, we sort of don't know, but it's sort of facilitative. Mm-hmm. Now, I do have to jump to our good friend Gabor Mate. Gabor talks about metagenetics.
Epigenetics.
Most of the DNA in our body is in flux. And some of it accidentally crosses on the chromosomes. It is affected, as Gabor points out, by temperature during birth. There are a lot of environmental influences. But Americans they used to think it was like punch out candy. Mm-hmm. Well, here's a gene for depression. Here's a gene for having a bright personality. Here's a gene for intelligence. And the Human Genome Project disproved naive geneticism. There are no such genes.
Dr. Drew still talks about on his shows, you can't be addicted if lots of people can do drugs and not become addicted, but those people don't have the gene. He still calls it the gene, and people still talk that way.
And they believe, so there's a naive geneticism that people believe, and that transformed into, and God bless her, Maya Salovitz just wrote a book on harm reduction, which is heartfelt. It's how she survived because when she was shooting up, somebody said, you know, you really need to clean those needles. And then when you clean those needles, you don't get HIV, then you survive and you get your college degree and you become a best-selling author. And so she really feels, she saw harm. Maya isn't a psychologist. She doesn't sort of understand mental illness, mental health. So she's a fan of what came in place of the Human Genome Project, which is big data. And the way they do all geneticists know that there's no gene for addiction. By the way, a man named Ken Blum discovered the alcoholism gene in 1990, and then he wrote a book in 1991 called Alcohol and the Addictive Brain. I write about this in my memoir. I had a cover story in the Atlantic about how the addictive gene was bullshit. he examined a bunch of mainly African-American men. They all had a similar dopamine allele, which is a variant receptor. And there is no gene for alcoholism. And then I reviewed his book, Alcohol and the Addictive Brain and Reason, and his lawyer threatened to sue me. I haven't actually ever been sued for anything I've written. And so I took the letter. I'm a pretty good street fighter. He was at the University of Texas, which he himself left in 1995 because he started promoting vitamins to cure alcoholism. And I called the dean of the University of Texas Medical School at Austin. I said, one of your faculty, I didn't talk to the dean. I talked to his administrator. And I said, one of your faculty has threatened to sue me for a review I wrote of their book. Can I send you his fax? We used to have faxes in those days. A copy of that letter. And then I never heard from Ken. I know Ken. I didn't get sued. And then in 1995, he left the university. So now big data, this is how big data works. There are so many millions of pieces of data on the genome that they run these vast multivariate analysis, which are only possible since the advent of modern computers. And then they say, well, 7% of bipolar is caused by genetic contributions from 37 different locales on the chromosome, which is another way of saying nothing. There's nothing that can be done with that information. You're not going to impact 37 different places on the chromosome.
But it's enough for reporters to report that we've narrowed down the gene for whatever you said, bipolar.
And God bless her, Maya believes in big data. She thinks that it's coming from the chromosomes, it's coming from our DNA in completely convoluted ways that human beings can't understand, but it's there. It's a thing. It's a way and we're getting back to, in a strange way, I'm not accusing Maya, of course, of believing in eugenics, but they thought idiocy and alcohol. In the 19th century, they thought alcoholism was inherited just as much as Ken Blum. So this is a brief history of genetics in America, and I'm going to take us right up to the present. Lewontin and Gould wrote frequently for the New York Review of Books, which is a liberal, progressive, New York-based intellectual magazine. And you could say it was anti-genetic because that was a political force. And then somebody came along. Do you know the name Oliver Sacks?
Yeah.
Oliver Sacks came to the United States from Oxford, and he started working at the Bronx VA hospital, which is down the prestige chain. And he was gay. And he wrote a book.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
Yeah.
And he's really focused on how different brain occlusions created entirely different delusions and ways of living.
Right.
But he himself loved classical music. He wrote plays. He was an extremely empathic man. He felt for his patient. I mean, he's working in the Bronx, for God's sake. I mean, he's not working at the Menninger Clinic. And people kind of loved him, and the New York Review of Books loved him. But he was many ways a reductionist. He was saying, well, look, if you screw up this circuit in the brain, then you get your wife in a hat mixed up. It's all coming out of you. But he experienced the clients. He dealt with the clients on a one-to-one basis. So there was a humanistic aspect, but his point of view was essentially reductive. So he, Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat was written in 1985, but he wrote an earlier book called Awakenings, I think in 1975. And then Oliver sat, for some reason in 1990, Penny Marshall made a film with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams called Awakenings. And Oliver Sacks went giant. And it's about a man that he gave L-Dopa to people who were basically catatonic. And then the story is, well, then he awakens to, I mean, they took some liberties with the story. Then you awaken to, it's sort of like Rip Van Winkle. Now what? And they put in a girlfriend, they had to. And how do you deal with all that? And it was a humanistic thing in a sense that it dealt with the human experience of a person, like if you just woke up Rip Van Winkle. Yeah. And he had that ability, Oliver Sacks, to talk about people. He talked about Tourette's syndrome. And one of his biggest stories that I like the best, the guy had Tourette's and they gave him Haldol and he stopped having Tourette's. But the guy didn't like not having Tourette's because he was really creative, he free associated. It was a side of who he was. Oliver Sacks was reductive in the sense that he thought he couldn't encapsulate, he dealt with the whole human experience of a person, but he couldn't deal with the entire integrity of a human being and how their existential identity was a result of all of their experience and determined all of their experience. And so he negotiated with this guy to just take Haldol during the week because he had to have a job. It's a little bit like MOAD, you know, or it's like a little bit like methadone. Well, we'll give you methadone, and that way you can work during the week. But if you don't like that experience, well, maybe there are times you don't have to take it. Mm-hmm. And so they worked out an arrangement where the guy stopped taking the Haldol on weekends and he could just like think and be free and be who he was, which was slightly crazy, but which was him and which he enjoyed. So I call it the divided states of America. We still have this underlying basal reductionist belief that everything's genetic and biological. Like when you go to a meeting, thanks for starting our talk with that. Well, you know, how is mindfulness created by your brain? And we sort of believe that, but something else has happened in America, which is the age of privilege. Americans are dimly aware that there's an elite part of America that has a lot of advantages. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, everybody wants their kids to have advantages. One of the most important books in America is something called The Dream Hoarders. It's about how it's not the upper 1/2 of 1% who runs America, it's the upper 20%. Forgive me, I know a lot of people like that. And their kids get the best training and they go to the best schools and they go to Harvard and they're spoiled and privileged, but they have a lot of training. And here's the ironic thing. The privileged class talks about genetics and disease theories, but they act as though they don't exist. Privileged people don't say, oh, my kid will never do well at school. They say, well, let's figure out how to get my kid to do well at school. Right. What special program can I enroll him or her in? Sometimes it involves medications. How can I give them, Adderall so they can concentrate better? The upper 20% of America is geared in the Dream Hoarders towards preserving and America, something Americans getting back to American exceptionalism. America now has the least social mobility of any Western society. America's image is you can always succeed by working hard. The reality is you're less likely, they divided America into quintiles, you're less likely to move up a quintile or down a quintile in America than in France and then in England. Don't they have the class structure there? Isn't there labor and lords? England is more socially mobile now than the United States. And so we live in a society where sort of people say, well, it's all genetic and biological and it's a disease, but to hell with that. My kid's not going to have a disease and not going to not end up at Columbia. And so getting back to my memoir, we can't escape the American burden. I mentioned Maya, God bless her, and Mark Lewis. He calls himself an evolutionary neuroscientist. Neither of them psychologists. neither Mark or Miles say, well, there are things you can do to inculcate self-efficacy and enhancement, which is, they're both privileged. They come from privileged backgrounds. They both had drug addiction periods, and now they're both big genius professors. That doesn't happen to every addicted individual like in Appalachia or Baltimore. And now drug policy reform, this is where I clash with the world as usual, has descended back into, drug policy reformers are going to say, well, people in Appalachia and Baltimore are born to be drug addicts. They're not going to go with Ken Blum and say, well, they have a drug addict gene. What are you going to do? And African Americans have more of them, and poor people have more of them. That's the answer. They're not going to say that. We've, Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead have had that much of an impact on America. We don't believe in naive geneticism, but we say, well, addiction is something, boom, we can fix it. Maybe we can tinker with something in the brain. That's becoming a little far-fetched, but we can give them medications, naltrexone, methadone, or buprenorphine, which somehow, what do they do exactly? Do they fix that biological addiction connection? What do they do exactly? That's a topic for another discussion. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, we've redescended to a biological, reductive, quasi-genetic, cryptogenetic, pseudogenetic, apropos of Gabor Mate, neogenetic model of life. But we've maintained some of its major elements, and it's the disease. Gabor believes in the disease model where you change your brain and it's permanently. And God bless, Mark Lewis is somebody who says, well, that's not true. The concept of plasticity in the brain changes. And getting back to what was wrong with Oliver Sacks, when they find people have brain injuries, what they find is that different parts of the brain compensate. And they compensate in the service of a larger sense of self and values and goals and motivation and environmental opportunity. So we've traveled the whole realm from eugenics to damn him Hitler, to cultural anthropology, to Lewontin and Gould, to evolutionary psychology, which is a modern social biology, to my friend Chris Ryan, to human genome. And by the way, we all worship and long for Barack Obama. He has a couple of negatives against him. One was Afghanistan. He started the war in Afghanistan for 20 years. And when we pulled out, it melted like quicksilver. And now we don't know. One reason we're not going to confront the Russians is because we just fought in Afghanistan for 20 years. Obama is a very smart man. You're not somebody who has an African father and his mother was an anthropologist who's lived in Indonesia and Hawaii and not be somewhat aware of cultural relativism. Obama was not a reductionist, but he introduced something that you may not have heard of, which has spent more money than the Genome Project, which is called the Brain Initiative. Mm-hmm. And the goal there is to measure every impulse in the brain. It's big, it's beyond big data. It's like atoms firing in the brain. And the claim was, well, now we'll be able to understand. We don't hear much about it because it's so obviously self-deluding.
It's like it's studying every atom in the universe or something. Yeah.
And then what?
Right.
And then when you've seen every atom in the universe banging around in your brain, then what do you do exactly?
Right.
What does it tell you? And how does it affect? And Obama's a human being who understands the impact of living. He's a man who's lived different lives. So I guess my bottom line is, America, the reductive, American exceptionalism, one of its main ingredients is genetic and biological reductionism, disease theories, and we're going to cure the brain. That's just how we think. Europeans think, I mean, in Britain, the disease theory of addiction sort of didn't exist. To the extent that it exists now, it's been imposed and imported from the United States. And the rest of Europe is even less. Italians and French people and Greek people think even less like in terms of biological diseases of the brain. But we're a spreading force in the world, and it's a negative force. So my little lesson's a little pessimistic. You and I, well, let me give one little optimistic. What group of people is most anti-reductive in terms of the human sciences, would you say?
Social psychologists.
Psychologists and whatever you are, developmental specialists and social people who actually better understanding of humans in relationship to their biology comes out, percolates up out of the ground from people who, A, see kids change, see the impact of social causation, and whose job it is. It's not your job to say, oh, you're doomed. They don't bring in people to schools and to work with people, say, oh, they'll never change. Except to the extent to some ways that's imposed by methadone and MOUD theories. And so, Zach, you and your wife who works with people who need help, and others of your ilk, counselors you know and teachers, some of whom, and you're always fighting off these, like in that meeting you described, these reductive impulses. Your job, and here's what I commit you to for the next century, or, you know, however long you're around, half century.
Century sounds good.
You need to generalize your scientific data and work and impact of working with children and seeing change and expanding change and believing in change and understanding that believing in change is part of change. You're the future of America. So I don't want to put too much of a weight on your shoulders, but thank good you're half my age or less. And, that's your mission for the rest of the day.
Better get started right away.
Yeah.
All right, Stanton, I'll see you soon.